One of the things that we wanted to talk about this week is something that we've noticed that's happening online. Just as we got what we view as more or less definitive proof that COVID came from a lab leak, we found ourselves walking into a wall of pushback that came seemingly almost out of nowhere and in a coordinated fashion, trying to present, sort of new light or new pushback and claiming that it was indeed a natural origin. And something that both you and I really found notable and again, were a little taken aback at the coordinated level of it.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. There's one survey in particular, fake survey, I should really say, that caught our attention. And I think it's worth talking about that in some detail, just to show the lengths of this kind of pushback against the lab origin, especially in light of what happened a few weeks ago. So, I mean, if we just rewind here for a few weeks, there was this release by US Right to Know of a whole bundle of documents. It was like 1,500 pages worth of emails and documents and things like that, which showed that the EcoHealth was collaborating with a guy called Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, and they were all collaborating with the Wuhan lab. So the three of them were basically had this blueprint for making COVID in a lab. Now, we of course knew that because that blueprint leaked, what was it, 2 years in 2021? So we've known since then. And to me, that was always the smoking gun. To me, when that happened in September of 2021, it was game over. But these new documents were really useful because they were basically the drafts of that blueprint. The blueprint itself is only like 30, 40 pages or whatever. And now we got 1,400 pages worth of notes to do with that blueprint, which give you a lot more detail about things like the furin cleavage site and the work they were going to do in Wuhan. And they even say, like in the blueprint, let's not say we're going to do it in Wuhan, but once we get the money from the US government, then we're just going to go and do it in Wuhan anyway, and things like that. Anyway, I don't want to rehash all of that. That was really, really bad for the natural origin people. So lo and behold, they got something new. And this is a so-called survey, a fake survey that was released by the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute. Never heard of them. Okay. So at first, the survey sounded like something interesting. Basically, what they were saying is that most virologists and biosafety experts, they had some categories of people that they supposedly asked, say that this thing came out of nature. And this was always one of these missing things, I guess, where, the media always said, oh, there's a consensus about it coming out of nature. And, people like you and I were like, well, what consensus? You don't know
Right.
that. No one's ever asked anyone. It's just a bunch of people around, Fauci who are screaming it, and that's it. So in principle, this was an interesting idea. Like, let's find out if there really is a consensus. Now, the consensus, as it was like in its most beneficial light on the side of these natural origin hoaxers, was about 80% of these people thought natural and 20% lab. And then in terms of having some doubts, it was like 50-50. So it wasn't even 80-20 like firm. Okay, fine. So that looked kind of somewhat impressive until you actually clicked on the button that took you to the survey and the methods and the numbers. And then the whole thing just fell apart. I mean, it was just incredible. I mean, which one jumped out at you the most? I think the one, the diffuse, the ones who did not know about diffuse, 78%.
There's a few other problems with it. And the study, for people that haven't seen it, looks beautiful. It's really nice and glossy, and, it looks very, very formal. But what jumped out immediately, I think probably everybody, frankly, who took a hard look at this, was that 78% of the people that participated in this survey had never even heard of the diffuse proposal. And, to think that you could go ahead and produce a survey that's then going to be used to, promote the fact that, hey, this is actually a natural origin and not a lab leak. And yet none of the people have heard of the underlying information, all of which points to it being a lab leak, is just shocking. Because it's the fact that they claim, this is virologists, this is scientists, right? There's a certain weight that's attached to this. But the fact that evidence is missing among so many of the respondents, saying that they've just not only are they not familiar with it in terms of the intricate details, but they've just never even heard of it, It's kind of like the equivalent of walking up to somebody on the street and asking them, the same question and seeing how they respond. It's incredible. I guess I found myself surprised by two things. One, the fact that so many people of scientists had never even heard of it. And two, I found myself questioning, how is that even possible within the scientific community? But nevertheless, to have that base. One thing that I think is also worth noting, just, you kind of mentioned some of the new evidence. You and I always approach this from an investigative vantage point, rather than a purely scientific. In other words, we're not virologists. We're incorporating the scientific data. We're incorporating what virologists bring to us, but we're looking at it from an investigative vantage point. And the new information that came out a month or two ago is what sort of put a lot of the virologists that we interact with over the hump, into the camp of, okay, done deal, it's over. It absolutely was a lab leak. And it was only then that this pushback happened, part of which is emblemized by this survey, which came out of nowhere.
That's right. And on that point, just to show you these limitations of the survey, and I think that's a very charitable way of putting it.
Yeah.
Because I think the whole thing is just fake. Here's how bad the survey was. They asked something like 1,150 people, something like that. That was the number of questionnaires they sent out, so to over 1,000 people. They only got about 160 responses. We'll get back to that in a moment. So, getting a 10, 12% reply rate in itself disqualifies the whole thing. It's just ridiculous, because it just means there's no interest, and the people who do respond have some kind of incentive. We'll get back to the incentives. We'll get back to the snowballing and so on.
I would just, I would argue that it goes even further than that, that it's not that people didn't have interest and a small subset did. I think what it indicates is how politicized this whole thing is.
Yeah, they're scared that even though it was supposedly anonymous, there's always ways of tracing it back to, whom you surveyed. There's always a way to do that, especially because of the snowballing, which we'll get back to here in a moment. But before that, I just want to say that among all the people that you just talked about, who obviously when Diffuse came out, they were like, whoa, this is really bad. And then when the new documents came out, they were like, yeah, game over here, like Richard E. Bright and, various others. Anyway, none of these people were among the 1,100 and whatever people who got questionnaires. So they did not include any of those people, neither any of the drastic people. The drastic people are the ones who got us that Diffuse proposal in the first place. They've been investigating this for 4 years. There's a bunch of, like Alex Washburn, for instance, he wrote papers about this stuff, Valentin Brittle. All these people did not get the questionnaire. So what does that tell you about whom they included in their survey? By the way, they don't give us a list of people whom they included, which is also very, very bad. I mean, I want to know who those 1,150 people are.
Yeah, they state right up front that it's anonymous, and they frame it around the fact that, that's to ensure the integrity of the study. And, like the virologists that you mentioned, just to make clear for everybody, it's not like these guys are just off on the fringe. I mean, Richard Ebright has got a resume that is just almost unparalleled. There's a reason that the FBI went to Richard Ebright when they started up a task force and they thought that, hey, maybe this thing came from EcoHealth. Who do they go to? They went to Richard Ebright because he's an expert. He doesn't even he's not even offered the chance to participate in the survey. Right there, that tells you there's a problem.
Well, and Matt Ridley and Alina Chan, who wrote a long book about it. And by the way, they wrote a book on both sides. I'm still fascinated that they were able to fill pages with words on the natural origin side, because, of course, other than it happened before, there is no evidence for natural origin. It just simply doesn't exist. And even the one that it happened before isn't really evidence, because when it did happen before with SARS, there were 774 deaths worldwide because this thing wasn't very infectious in humans, which is always the case when it's natural, because the virus needs to undergo changes and mutations in order to infect humans, whereas this one immediately infected humans. So even the fact that it happened before is an argument for lab leak, right? So there aren't any arguments. Notwithstanding that, Matt Ridley and Alina Chan wrote an entire book about this stuff. Were they among the people who got the survey? No. So that is, why not release that list? Release the list of the 1,100 and whatever it is. That we don't know who among those people answered, by the way, there's only 160 odd people who answered. I think we already mentioned that. So a very low percentage of people who answered. So we won't know among the 1,100 and whatever which ones answered. We don't know what they answered. So it's still anonymous in that sense if we get that list. I think what that list will show us is like the kind of a starting point bias, which is like, let's only write to certain kinds of people and let's not write to other kinds of people.
Yeah, you
Now,
know what this reminds me of, Hans?
Mm.
As soon as I saw this survey, the immediate thing that leapt to my mind was the study that was done back during the Obama days. 90% of scientists agree that climate change is real. That was then parroted. And, you know, the methodology whereby they came by that was the same sort of thing. They excluded a huge amount of respondents right out of the gate. They kept narrowing and narrowing the list. And so they ended up with, I think it was about 2,000 people, some of whom had responded multiple times. They were using their papers. And use that to extrapolate outwards that 90% of scientists agree, when as a matter of fact, it was a tiny little fraction that was, I think if memory serves, it was like 11% of the aggregate respondents, the way they discarded the first round. They kept narrowing it down. This kind of reminded me of that, you know, where you set out, you've got a goal in mind, and you find a methodology that allows you to achieve the goal that you wanted in the first place, as opposed to starting out with an honest system to arrive at an answer.
Exactly. And so how you choose those 1,150 people is extremely important in everything. You already predetermine how this is going to go. So unless we know who those people are, there's nothing we can trust about this. But there are many other reasons as well. I mean, we already mentioned the fact that among the ones who answered, like 160 odd, a full 78%, so 1 in 5, knew about diffuse, and 78% did not know about diffuse. How's that even possible? As you said, this is the most important piece of evidence in the entire origin saga. How can you call yourself a virologist or a biosafety expert and not know that? I mean, it's simply impossible. So did they just make it up that they didn't know about it because they didn't want to talk about it? Or did they really not know about it? And I think it's probably a mix between those two, which just tells you the low level of knowledge among these people, or the high level of deceit and dishonesty among these people, because those are the only two options you have, right?
Yeah.
And neither of those options are very good in terms of this survey meaning, anything. I mean,
well, nor do those two alternatives, which are probably a blend, not knowing and claiming you don't know. Neither of those things invalidate the 78% in terms of it being a discrediting of the whole survey, because the people that don't know, they shouldn't be involved in the survey. And if anybody's lying about their knowledge of the diffuse proposal, they shouldn't be anywhere near the survey. That tells you right out of the gate, that they're propagandists. So,
right, and we actually know that 1/3 of the people who replied did lie, which is another.
You're talking about the familiarity with this study that doesn't exist.
The Hanlon study. I mean, when I first saw this this thing come out last week, I was like so blown away by the 78% who claim not to know about diffuse, because as you say, it just disqualifies the whole thing. Game over. What's the point of even taking these people seriously at that point? So I missed that point, which I got to kind of later in the same day, where 1/3 of the people claim to be familiar with something called the Hanlon study. And there is no Hanlon. There is no Hanlon study. So the people who did the questionnaire put up the study and they gave it a name, origin of SARS, blah, 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 National Academy of Sciences proceedings, it's like all, as you say, it looks nice and whatever, it's all there. And they made it out as if this was a real study. And then they asked the surveyees about that. And 1/3 of the surveyees said, yeah, I'm familiar with that. It doesn't exist. It's a fake study. It simply doesn't exist. Now, the reason why it was there, and this is to the credit of this Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, is you put these things in surveys as a control measure, because you want to gauge if these people are lying to you. The trouble is that the good thing is they did put in the control. The trouble is They didn't tell anyone about it. I mean, when they published this, when they put out their report, they didn't say, "Oh, we found that 1/3 of virologists are liars." That was not the headline.
Yeah, no, that was something that had to get discovered. The fact there was no disclosure that the study didn't exist. That information came out as some of the other virologists looked at that and said, "Wait a minute, there is no such thing." You know, this all coincided with this giant pushback against the, it just came out when we noticed, you and I noticed a number of accounts that suddenly popped up kind of out of nowhere and made, big inroads into the conversation. And they started creating their own little echo chamber with some of the people that should be familiar to, folks out there, like Peter Daszak, Christian Anderson, Robert Gary, Peter Horton, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they kept including them in their conversation and were promoting this survey and promoting other elements, claiming that there was a natural origin. And a lot of these guys, one in particular is, a quote unquote disinformation expert at, what was it, Oxford, I think?
Yeah.
Sander Vander something, Linden.
Sander, right, yeah.
Yeah. And, they started trying to create, you could see it right before your eyes, this very notable echo chamber that was trying to be fomented. So I think we're seeing some of the desperation out there about not continuing to stick to the fact, this false claim that it actually was a natural origin, when in fact the evidence is overwhelming that it's a lab leak. And to have not seen, for people that aren't sure, the diffuse proposal, especially with the new information, is something that I know you and I think this, and I know a number of the virologists think this now, like that's the smoking gun. It's not a small thing. To not have full knowledge of the diffuse proposal is astonishing.
Or as these people claim to have any knowledge, like no knowledge, like never heard of it. 1/5 knew and 4/5 did not know. I mean, how completely disqualifying is that? If the number were 2% who did not know, that would be too high. I mean, this is literally the one thing where if you have a survey, everyone needs to know about this. Otherwise, there's no point in doing the survey. The other thing that, Sander, of course, was promoting this big time, super happy about it. Even Christian Anderson, the proximal fraud guy, he got back. He said, "I'm leaving Twitter." Remember that? That was just a few weeks ago. Well, he came back because, he wanted to push this fake study. The other point I just want to come back to
he came back
here,
because he felt he had some ammo on his side.
Exactly right. So you had all the usual kind of people, Science Magazine, stenographers, and so on, all kind of jumping in there and promoting this without talking about these huge defects that we've already mentioned. I just want to come back to the snowballing, because that's the one that has not really been talked about even online, or not much. And I think it's a very, very important point here, just in case we haven't already listed enough points why this so-called study is completely and utterly debunked. Snowballing is when in surveys you allow the people being surveyed to give you suggestions for other people. So the first problem that this global institute group, Catastrophic Risk Institute, encountered, by the way, I don't want to digress, but if you look at their list of publications, they kind of all go in the climate change. That's their those are their priors of these people. Okay, let's leave that aside. So these people sent out these questionnaires. They only got like 10% of people coming back, and like, oh, that's not good. We need to try and do more. And in fact, it was much less than 10% that came back, because 10 or 12% is the final number. So what they then did, which is also a big, big no-no for these kinds of surveys, you just can't do it. They personally contacted the people. So the institute personally contacted the surveyees and said, hey, we sent you the survey, could you, and whatever. As soon as you do that, the whole thing is tainted. You can't do that, for anonymity and for pressure and for various other reasons. But it gets even worse. They asked the people who did respond to suggest people to other names that let's send this to some other people. So let's say Christian Anderson responded, like, Christian, can you give us a few other names of people who might want to respond to this? Well, of course, those people are going to be on his side if he's going to choose them, right? To be clear, we don't know if he was the one of the people who got to choose, but we do know that they allowed this snowballing to happen, which completely destroys the entire survey, if it wasn't already completely destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, and we've seen this happen again. And by the way, that study I mentioned regarding the climate scientists agree, they did exactly the same thing. They reached out to a select group of scientists that had responded in the fashion they wanted and, narrowed in on them and asked for other affiliate scientists. So it seems to be a repetition of the trick that was pulled with the climate scam. It,
Right. And none
so
of the people who reported on this ever mentioned any of these failures. I mean, Science Magazine did a piece on it, which they do, to be fair, mention some of these failures further down in paragraph whatever. But again, the headline is all about all virologists agree this came out of nature. So that's sort of what they wanted. That's their fake narrative. That's what they wanted to achieve with this, and obviously they have achieved it because they got all those headlines and they got everyone to circle the wagons once more. And this is the theme you've been talking about, that anytime something really, really bad happens, like with this with the diffuse drafts that we got like a few weeks ago, there's always the circling of the wagons happening. People like Sander just kind of pop out of nowhere, and for some reason they're like extremely like promoted on Twitter. I still don't understand that. Why do I keep seeing this guy's tweet? Well, not anymore because he blocked me, because I called him out on some of his crap. But and I think he blocked you too, right?
yeah.
But yeah, how is that? That every time something like that happens, you always got people just spawning up out of nowhere to push back. And it's the same thing over and over. And by the way, it's not just with Origin, it's with climate, it's with Russiagate, it's with Biden corruption, it's, any topic, you name it and it happens. It's with Russia as well, right? I mean, look at Tucker goes to Moscow and immediately, there's this big circling of the wagons.
Yeah, and you brought up a point that I actually kind of meant to address anecdotally. And going back to Sander van der Linden, his name kind of cracks me up, but you talked about this promotion effort. As you said, he came out of nowhere and suddenly was kind of like this large voice. You kept seeing him over and over again, and you talk about this promotion. And he was being promoted, and I'll give you an example of that is I got caught up in a conversation with him and Eric Schmidt, a senator from Missouri, who ended up responding to Sander and basically calling him out as being a purveyor of disinformation. For those who don't know, Sander van der Linden is a quote-unquote disinformation expert. He has a book out there, and he's a big self-promotion guy, but didn't have a real big following, didn't have a real big voice. And suddenly, he's promoted to the point where a senator from Missouri feels compelled to respond to him. And so there are some real questions as to why this pushback, not only it's, like if you and I were doing this, we wouldn't be elevated any more than we already are, just, through having built up an audience. These are guys with, smaller followings who are getting an exaggerated presence on Twitter out of nowhere all of a sudden, which, raises its own set of questions, because we've always felt like there's an underlying need, there's an underlying question that needs to be answered, is why is the government so aggressively pushing back on this? And by way of association, why are these accounts that spring up out of nowhere, some of which are real, some of which may not be, are getting so much support and so much traction?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I sometimes feel like, am I the only person here living in, and you, of course, in just the real world where, there's no kind of things like that going on, where no one tells me what to say, and I'm not, there's something else that happened along those lines where I just fell off my tree. Remember Jesse Bloom? We've talked about him before.
Yeah.
He's the virologist who uncovered the fact that up until this morning, I thought, he's a good guy. He uncovered the fact that the U.S. government hid an early COVID sequence on behalf of the CCP, which is terrible. You can't do that. And then as soon as he discovered that, unfortunately, he went to Fauci rather than, just kind of tell the public about it. The public only found out about it much later. And then Fauci immediately called, on Sunday, they had this emergency conference, how do we make this problem go away? How do we make this Jesse Bloom guy go away? So anyway, I thought he's been realistic and honest on Origin and, various issues to do with COVID. And then this morning, I saw he published a paper with Christian Andersen. I mean, I fell off my tree. I'm like, what? Christian Andersen wrote the proximal fraud paper. He lied and lied over and over. He said one thing in public, and his Slack messages are replete with, the truth about the origin of COVID. It's all there. How can you publish with a guy like that? Now, I'm not, I don't know what the reason is. I have no idea. But it's those instances that really make me think, like, what's going on? I mean, what's going on with people? Where are there, like, it's not even about loyalties. It's just about just certain things you can't do. And then and they still do it. And I was completely perplexed.
It feels like there's extreme pressure that's being brought to bear in areas that you and I can't see.
Right.
When you talk about Jesse Bloom, he discovered that sequence, and it was NIH that pulled it off of their GenBank, their website that publishes the sequences. And so they literally delayed getting the sequence of COVID out into the public realm. NIH did. And when NIH was retroactively asked about this, a representative from Health and Human Services had to respond to Congress and came up with what was really a ridiculous explanation. Just, the sequence wasn't completely filled out, et cetera. And so it was our protocol. It's bullshit. That's not true. But whatever. That's the explanation that was given. And what caught my attention, well, obviously the Health and Human Service interface caught my attention. But on a side note, what I did notice is that Jesse Bloom came in and was running cover for the NIH and saying, it's not their fault, this would be a natural reaction for their behalf. And these were tweets that were, maybe a couple weeks ago that he was sending out. And I had the same reaction, not as strongly as to him publishing with Christian Anderson, but thinking like, wait a minute, he's now running interference for having them pull the sequence off. I was really kind of floored. And we've seen this time and again where people that you think have all the information at their fingertips and have already kind of made the connections, and then all of a sudden they seem to come out with a strange opinion that's supportive of Fauci or NIH that is very surprising. And, we know that NIH has the purse strings, and that's a major problem. That with their billions and billions in grants that they can make, they can sway a lot of people, or at least keep people from wanting to speak out against them. But nevertheless, there's really been this surprising, like I said, I think there's a pressure that's being brought to bear that you and I aren't part of. Or really.
That's right. And it reminds me of Justin Kenny, of course, who's been fantastic. Again, just one of these, you and I don't know this biology in granular detail, even though we've learned quite a lot about it over the course of the past few years. So we've, had to learn. And there's probably a handful of people like, Alex Washburn and Justin Kenny and Alina Chan and a few others where we, Rosanna, of course, Rosanna Segreto, she taught me a lot about how this stuff works. He was one of them. A very, sound guy, super. And all of a sudden, again, it was like last week or so, he just drops off Twitter and he says, I can't talk about this anymore. Very cryptic message.
Yep.
And someone got to him. And now he makes it pretty clear that someone got to him. He doesn't say who. We know that his lab has deep entanglements with China. So that's a pretty hot trail there. But to his credit, he said something. Many other people, as you mentioned, they just drop off. They're just gone all of a sudden. We don't know, where are they? Why aren't they on Twitter anymore? Why aren't they talking about this anymore? And we suspect something happened there. And, in Justin's case, at least he said so. I mean, he said that something happened and that he's now going to drop off. He didn't say what happened, but you're so right. There are all these machinations going on, which you and I just have no idea how bad it is in the background of pressure campaigns and coercion and so on.
And so from there, the question becomes why? Why is all of this happening? And, what we can just point to, I think, is in part funding. We know that funding came from the DOD. We know that NIH provided funding to EcoHealth. Effectively that it was American scientists. I mean, I guess that's one of the kind of the big undercurrents here, is that for all the finger pointing that's going on to China, and China was the one that leaked it. I mean, that's, they have culpability for that. It came out of their lab. They did it at a BSL-2, et cetera, as opposed to a BSL-4. So they were conducting the experiments at a woefully low security level lab. But at the same time, the technology and the underlying basis for doing the experiments came from American scientists associated with both EcoHealth and really probably more fundamentally with Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina. And that's
right. And I've always felt, is that enough of a reason to stage this ginormous cover-up because you're embarrassed that you gave the Chinese the technology, the humanized mice, the blueprint, and so on? Yeah, that is a pretty big incentive to cover things up, or in Fauci's case, to fund it. So that's a pretty big incentive. But is that really enough? Because as you say,
right,
that's not the same as you didn't leak it, you didn't unleash it on the world. So that's that culpability. You didn't decide to do it at BSL-2, as you say. That culpability is 100% with the Chinese side. So that has always been a bit of an enigma. Why this huge cover-up that extends right, that the fact that EcoHealth is still being funded by the Pentagon, like now, I mean, like what? And the only thing that makes
not
sense
just
is
still
that,
being funded, but funding that was reinstated after it was taken away.
exactly, Congress decided to take it away, and it was decided, and the Pentagon decided, no, we're still going to fund these people. So the only thing that makes sense to me, and because I don't think that just being embarrassed is enough of an incentive to go that far.
No.
The only thing that makes sense to me is that the United States, like many countries, has a bioweapons program of some kind. Now, there's a biological weapons convention and so on, and you're supposed to follow it and this and that. But that other countries are up to stuff, so you want to kind of be up to stuff. That this is my speculation here. And a lot of these characters that we keep hearing about, and people involved in the cover-up on the science side, were somehow entangled with that. And the idea is to protect these people, not necessarily with respect to COVID specifically, but kind of just more generally. We don't want people digging into our various programs and it's not just the bioweapons or biodefense, whatever you want to call it. Those two things are the same. This is two sides of the same coin. But also things like spying on other labs, spying on other countries' capabilities. I mean, there's so much to that. And that's the only explanation that I can come up with.
Well, we also have, and I agree wholeheartedly, but we also have the other kind of disturbing elements that we talked about in one of our last week's shows, where we went through this very strange juxtaposition of Fauci's early take on COVID, where he was telling everybody not to worry about it, that it wasn't a big deal at all, going against everybody else in the Trump administration, and his later stance where he was very worried about it. And, at the same time that he was telling everybody not to worry about COVID, you don't need masks, you really should be worrying about the flu. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, he had already embarked on production of mRNA vaccines. And, those things raise a lot of questions, which, we explored more fully in the prior episode. But yeah, it definitely hints at something deeper and something darker here.
Well, we'll keep an eye on it. And
before we go, though, I do want to raise something that's bothered me a lot and hear what your thoughts are on it. When we were doing some digging here, one of the things that came up was the fact that Christian Anderson and Robert Gary, two of the primary players, both co-authors of proximal origin, and involved in Fauci's secret teleconference, those guys co-ran the Kanema lab in Sierra Leone. And Sierra Leone, for those who don't know, is where the outbreak of Zaire's Ebola hit in 2014 and then again in 2018. And unfortunately, that's the first time that Zaire Ebola has ever broken out in the Sierra Leone, Guinea area, because its origin, its place of natural refuge is more than 1,000 miles away. And it just so happened that their lab happened to be working on those diseases and actually had them. We have Christian Anderson on tape saying that he had Zaire Ebola in the Kanema lab. And the question that makes me wonder is how many other times have things escaped from a lab where there's been a cover-up and that's never been exposed? And maybe that's part of what they're worried about here, because the anecdotal evidence actually seems to be pretty strong that Ebola might have come out of the Kanema lab run by Anderson and Gary. How many times has this happened? We know that a lab leak is far more often happens far more. It's a much greater occurrence, a much higher percentage than of a virus leaping from nature into the human population, from animal to human, zoonotic. And so part of me wonders, is part of the cover-up tied to the fact that maybe there's other instances of this that were also, really resulted in dire consequences that we don't know about.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, there was the Soviet one that was covered up, the anthrax leak in the 70s. successfully covered up, and we only found out the truth after the fall of the Iron Curtain. But on the this topic of Anderson and Gary, there is that one email, and I think you're absolutely right, and this really backs it up. Is Ron Fouché on the day of the secret teleconference? So on the day when they were discussing the fact that COVID had this furin cleavage site and all these engineered looking features, and this looked really, really bad, right? And Ron Fouché wrote the group an email after they hung up, and he said, if people are going to start looking into lab leak with COVID, then people are also going to ask questions about other previous diseases and outbreaks and pandemics. And that was a big, wink, wink in terms of exactly what you were just saying there. So it was like, yeah, we need to circle the wagons. A lot of incentives, certainly all around. But I just feel that there's this overarching big incentive that involves these people and their work, as you say, in terms of previous leaks, but also other work, ongoing work, whatever they're up to. And in terms of in tandem with the Pentagon, that is causing the circling of the wagons to be so extreme, the cover up to be so extreme and so sort of all encompassing. And as you say, to have all these people, every time something bad happens on the natural origin side, have all these people come out of the woodworks.
Yep. It like you said, it seems to be a huge vested interest that's lurking out there. And that vested interest may be wrapped up in the, sort of a national security concern, a false one, but nevertheless probably wrapped up in that. So, it has been fascinating to watch this opposition come out of nowhere. It's surprising as well, because we hit a point where you and I kind of thought, okay, the debate's settled, and maybe that's when the opposition redoubled its efforts and became the strongest.
That keeps happening, right? I'm still very optimistic that we will eventually know. Well, we do know. I mean, I have no doubt whatsoever this came out of a lab, and this couldn't be more clear. But we will know in a way that everyone will understand that it came out of a lab.
Yep, I'm hopeful of that as well.